My name is Wynne. This is my father.
Richard.
And if you watched the last video, you will know that. I do suggest that you go and watch the last video because this is part 2. We did try and explain in various scattered video clips at the end that we ended up speaking for about 40 minutes and then the phone panicked because my editing app backs up the videos, which is great, but it meant that I didn't have enough storage space.
And we were really getting into it, weren't we? And I felt like we were on a kind of a flow, and then suddenly it went.
I remember where we were because I have I love you, but I do have a better memory than you.
Yeah, you're probably I'm like well old.
But we were talking, so we left off talking about how initially, so this is like Cushing versus Lee, although you should know that from the thumbnail. How Lee was keen not to be typecast in kind of his Hammer roles, so he did a lot of international work and he spoke a number of languages, didn't he? But then, ironically, I think he ended up doing other vampiric stuff in other countries, and then he came back and did, how many Hammer Draculas were there? Like 8?
Something like that. I'd have to check the details, but I have a theory about that, because it's documented that Lee was frustrated that Hammer didn't allow him to, in his view, to do the Bram Stoker Dracula, and some of the later movies he barely spoke and seemed to be basically just a beast, whereas he did. I think it was. I mean, you'll need to check the details.
Was it the Spanish?
Yes, it was called Count Dracula, I think. And it actually began much like the Gary Oldman Dracula, which obviously was much later, with a much older Dracula, a kind of old man Dracula, that then gets younger after he meets Harker. So it's much more like the book, and what's more, his Dracula in that film talks a lot more. As a result, and I suppose it's also because it was a fairly low budget film, it ends up being quite talky, quite kind of a bit like, more like the Bela Lugosi Dracula in a funny sort of way.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, because the Bela Lugosi one is interesting. Obviously it doesn't necessarily follow that because you've seen the Hammer Dracula that you'll know the Bela Lugosi one, but I have mentioned on this channel that the Bela Lugosi Dracula is directed by Todd Browning in 1931. That was the first like classic horror film that I saw, and it's interesting because it is not Stoker's Dracula at all.
No.
I would argue that Hammer's Dracula, although it really again is not Stoker's Dracula, is somehow closer to Stoker than. But what's interesting about Bela Lugosi one is it starts with Renfield, and then they have a scene where, I mean, spoilers, but I'm assuming you know Stoker's novel. They have the scene where he's on the boat, and he's gone loopy. And obviously, I mean, I think there's a Thorley Walters part in, I think it's Dracula Prince of Darkness. The character's called Ludwig, I think, and he eats flies, so they have a kind of Renfield-like character in this.
So they've had elements in some of them. But I know that Lee was frustrated that he didn't have much genuine Stoker dialogue, and I know that it was a matter of personal pride that he tried to sneak in a bit of dialogue, even in as late as the Satanic Rites of Dracula. There's a conflict. There's a conflict between his Dracula and Peter Cushing's Van Helsing, who at this point was Lorimer Van Helsing, I think. Is he, or is he something else now?
Oh no, it is Lorimer.
But he says, I who have commanded armies. All that. So he's alluding to the history of the I guess the Vlad Tepes, the much older kind of warrior lord, much more than the modern. Well, I say modern, but the more recent Dracula. So that was, I think, Lee desperately trying to put a bit of Stoker into it. But I know he was increasingly frustrated by the way that each of the films came about, because they were pre-sold to America, and then they kind of relied on the fact that he would do it. And I know eventually he just got sick of it.
It's funding, though, isn't it? I mean, I know,
yeah.
I think we
And
might
that's
have
the reason,
spoken about the fact that you get to a point in Hammer's history, where, like, you can tell that they're running out of money, and that they're using the same sets, and because, unfortunately, I think I can't remember which video I discussed this in, but the Hammer company that exists now is Hammer in name only. It has no relation to. I don't know if I'm guessing they got some kind of right to, but you know, people own. Countless companies own the films, so I'm assuming they got some kind of right to the name.
I suppose so. Yes.
I don't know. And you know, relying on that American.
But the older Hammer movies, they were kind of like a family. A lot of the same directors, a lot of the same cameramen, and it was a kind of a family feeling.
I don't know if I mentioned this in the last one. Apologies if I did. It's been a while. I remember that I've mentioned like Cushing's autobiographies like countless times, linking to the idea that it's family and they all knew each other very well. There was an instance where he was struggling for money because I think something that we touched on in the last video but didn't make it because the phone panicked was the idea that they had very different senses of ambition, I think, and you know, Cushing just wanted to work. I'm not saying that like Lee was like a Ponzi so-and-so that would only do things for money, but he came from very different backgrounds. Like he had royal, I think his mother was a duchess.
You're right.
But there was a time where I think Cushing was struggling with like I think their roof or something had gone odd, and somebody like deposited a small amount of money in the envelope on top of his salary so that he could afford to fix his roof. In fact it was for Dracula Prince of Darkness. That's what it was, because they feature a clip from it's for Dracula Prince of Darkness that he wasn't actually in that film, apart from the tiny clip that they used from the beginning of the first one.
Flashback.
And he obviously they own that footage. He was working for the company. He doesn't like, although he's a person within himself, it isn't like usual practice. I don't know if it's changed now, but in those days it wasn't usual practice to pay somebody to like use a clip that they were in, and they insisted on paying him because they knew that he was struggling financially.
I think both men, Lee and Cushing, I think they loved to work. I know that Cushing loved to work. I wonder whether Lee was perhaps a bit more ambitious. Maybe he wanted to be more internationally known.
Yeah, I mean,
and also wanted to get away from Hammer. Wanted to, as you've alluded to get away from being known as Dracula. But yes, so many different projects. But also, of course, he lived so much longer. And he was about 10 years younger than Cushing anyway, but even so, went right up into the early 2000s.
That, I think, is really strange because certainly when I first started watching their films, I think I assumed age-wise that it would be the other way around. But, you know, he has a maturity to him, which I don't mean that he looked old necessarily. I just mean his presence, his authority. The authority that Lee carried, it felt, certainly when they were on screen together, it wasn't a battle for the more superior actor.
No, they had a great affection for each other. They were great friends, and I think they really appreciated what the other could bring to the film. Different styles. I think Lee played the slightly buttoned up, slightly pompous gentleman very well, and that wasn't just in Hammer but also in Amicus movies. There's that you'll tell me which one
it
is.
Dr. Terror's House of Horrors?
Where he's an art critic.
Yeah, it's Dr. Terror.
But also he's similarly pompous as Henry Baskerville. He's also quite pompous in the Horror Express as well. But later in his career, he did play villains. Certainly, he was a Bond villain. Of course, people will know he was Scaramanga in The Man from the Golden Gun. But also, he was in musicals. I forget what it's called. Whether it's like Captain. Oh goodness, I don't know if it's Captain Serious or Captain Sensible or something. There is a film which is incredibly camp and rather kitsch.
Oh yeah, you showed me the trailer.
And there's a song
gosh.
in which he shows a character all sorts of different drinks he has in his bar. He was also in the sequel to Gremlins, and then of course, I mean, they both were in Star Wars, but I think Lee does it, whether even though he tries to get away from it sometimes and does occasionally play lighter or even heroic parts, he's always quite intimidating, and I think certain actors, I think on set, have said they were quite in awe of him, whereas I think sometimes Cushing could play the villain like Frankenstein exceptionally well and could be quite scary, quite alarming and quite intimidating, quite sort of freaky in his performance, but he could also play friendly and gentle. And in fact, there was a film that you and I, in fact, and my son, we watched the other evening, which was his first Doctor Who portrayal.
Yeah, we're going to do a video.
And some reviewers said that they really liked Cushing and always liked Cushing in every role he played, but he was following on after William Hartnell, and some reviewers said that they felt that Hartnell had a kind of a vicious edge to his performance, which you sense that he was a bit grumpy, a bit kind of irascible, but also that maybe there was a side to him that wasn't entirely human. Cushing plays a kindly grandfather type.
But that's not to say...
But that was deliberate. It's obviously what he wanted to do.
Yeah, exactly, because that's not to say that he didn't ever have that edge.
Oh, no.
I mean, like, Sherlock Holmes, I know, like, The Hand of the Baskervilles, there's this sort of very manic kind of...
absolute,
ball of adrenaline.
And clearly, obviously, he's very dark, very kind of unpleasant. As Frankenstein as well.
Yeah,
he's clearly the villain.
Just out of interest, so I think first of all, would you say that we'd agree that, I mean, Cushing effectively like made a living out of killing Lee in films. So I think it's interesting that, I mean, I suppose it might have been part of the fact that often Lee was playing the monster. That added
certainly
his
in the early Hammers, definitely.
Yeah, to his sort of commanding.
And
quite scary.
Cushing had been known a long time as a TV star, whereas Lee was coming to it having played bit parts, and initially wasn't really required to say very much, because as the monster in Frankenstein and as the mummy in Hammer's first Mummy movie, he's mute. And I think perhaps people, until Dracula, I'm not sure that people realised just how mellifluous and rich and deep his voice was.
I know that you've mentioned before that the depth of his voice does point to the fact that he could sing.
Yes, he was an operatic bass.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, people are surprised to discover that late in his career,
heavy metal.
He was in heavy metal albums, but it's because he had traced his family lineage to Charlemagne, medieval king. So I think emperor. I'm no expert on it, but it was. So he sang these songs about fighting the Saxons and all these kind of bloody and brutal kind of wars, and then set to music with distorted electric guitars and what have you. Yeah, incredible. But also, I know we alluded to this last time we mentioned The Wicker Man, but there is a moment, there's a scene in that where he sings.
Yeah.
Lovely voice, actually, very nice voice. I don't know whether Cushing could sing.
I think he did do a little singing dance routine with Morcambe Wise.
Ah, yes. That was a sketch where he was.
There was a constant, there was a running gag that they owed him £5 because they didn't pay him last time.
Did they do a kind of a comedy Shakespeare?
No, I think it was Camelot, Knights of the Round
Table.
Oh,
it could have been actually.
I think he was King
yes,
Arthur.
you're right.
Yeah, but no, I think, and there's at least that I can think of a couple of films where you can hear him kind of humming to himself, like as dotty old professor, like. I mean, he didn't tend to be very dotty, but he's played. I mean, the kind of the Doctor Who grandfatherly sort of, as you said, it's deliberate. It was in the script, and he knew what
that
he
was the
doing.
choice that he and the director and the script writer had made. But there's sometimes, as you said, like the Sherlock Holmes, there's sometimes that slightly blunt edge to him as well, which is what the part requires, and it's why I think perhaps he was an actor that had a little bit more range, perhaps. I don't know.
I think so.
I think Lee tended to be kind of dark, pompous, or kind of a bit brutal and animalistic.
Yeah, I think
tended to play the villain card a lot.
But I mean, Cushing. Yeah, I would say, although he had countless roles as doctors and professors, and I mean, it's I remember Jonathan Rigby when speaking about the skull, which is probably my favourite Cushing, spoke about the fact that the description of the character in Rod Block's short story is basically Cushing down to a T. A very kind of scholarly type who's very obsessed with quite random specific things, but as you said, in terms of range, I wouldn't say that every role is exactly the same.
But he manages to be likeable.
Definitely.
In a lot of parts, actually.
But even
you kind of root for him almost.
Yeah.
even as Frankenstein.
Yeah. I mean, there's that one scene where it's spoilers. I'll put a timestamp so you can skip it. In The Curse of Frankenstein, there's the bit where he's in the crypt and he removes that professor's brain, and then Paul comes down into the crypt, gets angry with him. They have a little fight, and it ends up getting broken, and obviously that's the reason that the monster goes loopy. But there's just the look in his eyes and just the sheer panic, like it's almost like he's a little boy again. And you're kind of like, oh no, it's all going wrong. But obviously it's not good because he's killed somebody and then broken into his tomb to remove his brain. But also at the end, I remember the first time I watched it, it was a school night, it was very late, I was on my own. Just that feeling, knowing that you're completely alone, because he obviously at the end of the first one goes to the guillotine, and Elizabeth has effectively left him for his best friend. Sure. We know where that's headed eventually, because there were 6 Frankensteins, I believe. Question, I know that this is hard, but if you had to choose Frankenstein or Dracula, the series, what would you choose?
Well, I think the script writers and the directors always manage to find something a bit different for Frankenstein to do. Slightly different circumstances. Occasionally, some of the films actually
were rebooted.
Well, but they also dabbled in metaphysics.
Yeah.
There's one in which I think it's Frankenstein Created Woman, where he's actually grappling with the soul.
Yeah, soul transference.
And so you've got a woman with the consciousness of a man as well as herself, and it's history repeating itself as well. And they somehow they managed to trap this kind of glowing orb of the soul. I think with some of the Draculas, I think the first few including the one that Lee isn't in, I think they're quite good in terms of quality. But I think the last few, until we got to the 1970s ones, I think they got a bit formulaic. And as I said earlier, and I'm inclined to agree with Lee on this, I think that he was essentially resurrected somehow, and then he was almost immediately killed.
Yeah.
And for a large part of the movie, he wasn't given much to do except bite someone's neck. I don't think they really delved into the character sufficiently.
I will say some of his deaths are quite interesting. There's one where he's like encased in ice,
fact,
and there's like a giant glowing crucifix.
Almost all of those latter ones, the latter 19th century ones, they start with the death from the previous film. So I just think there are even some films where I gather that they kind of somehow shoehorned Dracula and Lee into a film that was not actually going to be a Dracula. So I think that it gets a bit disappointing. But then at least, while they're not considered critical darlings, I think 1972 and the Satanic Rites, at least there's a different spin. And Satanic Rites in particular actually sets up Dracula as being the head of some kind of organisation, and there are scenes in which he does talk to Van Helsing. But I think it was just a pity that they didn't take the time to flesh the character out or give him a bit more interesting dialogue.
I think it's the casting, to be perfectly honest, for some of the middle ones. Lee's there, and whilst you can still feel his presence, it's not as big, partly because he's not given, as you said, much to do, and because he doesn't have the dialogue. There's one, I don't know, it's either Scars or Taste the Blood of, or possibly Has Risen from the Grave, I don't know. The one with Veronica Carlson and Barbara Ewing, I like that one.
That's where there's actually a lot of action on the roofs of the city.
I like that one.
Yes.
But I would say that I partly like that one because the cast is so good. Somebody like Veronica Carlson. We watched Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed recently, and I believe that I have discussed that, unfortunately, in another video. I think
she does actually convey fear and passion very well.
The scene where the body appears when the I think like a drain bursts or something, and she has to drag it out. But she's brilliant, and I think, I don't know, I think the other ones just feel as though they're missing something.
The first Dracula, I think remains my favourite, partly because
I would say so
it was fresh at the time. It was shocking that it was in colour and the gore was so vibrant, and there's that sensuality, that sexuality about Lee's portrayal that no actor had really managed to convey in the past.
I think that's perhaps another difference between Lee and Cushing. Cushing seldom played like a sort of romantic lead.
True.
He did have a couple, but it's really odd, when you see him giving somebody a snog, because or being happily married or having kids, because he's often sort of
but he played old a lot, didn't he?
Yeah, that just hides away in his study, and I think there's
it's like he's single-minded, isn't he? He's so focused on his science, or as Van Helsing, he's focused on the rituals and the ways to kill a vampire.
They both have, in terms of, I suppose, attractiveness. I suppose they both have things going for them, I suppose. I wouldn't really go as a lesbian, and I know that you're not attracted to men in that way, but they're not, Yeah,
I guess that Cushing could play heroic.
No, but in terms of playing romantic leads, they could both do it, but I think that possibly because Lee often, he played Dracula so many times, and there's that sensuality and sexuality that's so closely tied to kind of the theme of vampirism. And like I've explored this in my sociology stuff. I've done sociology modules at uni, and I did it at A level, and there is like an unshakable sexual element to the very nature of the vampire. And I think, I mean, I know that a couple of videos ago I discussed Corruption, which was probably that is a film in which you see Cushing say "I love you" the most. I don't think I've ever really heard him say that, actually, because he never, as you said, very single-minded, not like in a cold way.
Is he actually? Is he? I haven't seen this film, but is he obsessed with his wife?
Yes, I mean it's weird.
So his obsession is her rather than the science.
Yeah.
That's unusual.
Well, that is thing,
unusual.
Because he's killing for her.
Right.
But then also the dynamic there is quite interesting, because he doesn't want to keep doing it, but he doesn't want her to do it, because then that sort of, I don't know, maybe taints her womanliness or whatever. But it's interesting. I mean, thinking of like kind of the latter Dracula films, I would agree with you that the first one is the best, but I would say that a close second in the Dracula series for me would be 1972. And I love the Satanic Rites, and I know that you like that one because it's much more of a thriller.
Yes.
But something I really love about Stephanie Beacham's Jessica Van Helsing is that she's got a really lovely relationship with Van Helsing. And it's not really a dynamic that's explored much in the second one.
Definitely.
And I think that's interesting because...
well, she's supposedly a bit older in the sequel, isn't she?
Yeah, but I mean, Cushing's chemistry is usually with Lee, but obviously that's interesting. That's a different dynamic because he's fighting Lee. So to have a daughter, well, not a daughter, a granddaughter that he's very close to. And also, I think it is nice, though, in Satanic Rites, you know, she's got older, he trusts her more.
Yeah. She's actually much more on the mission. Yes.
Yeah.
She's part of the team investigating what's going on, whereas I think she was with her friends and she was younger and was much more a victim, I think, in 72. And also part of the group of young people that took part in a ritual that brought about the resurrection of Dracula, whereas in the Satanic Rites, Dracula is already resurrected, which is an unusual situation. What I would say, further to what you were saying earlier, I think that there are stronger vampire movies in Hammer that are not Dracula.
The Vampire Lovers.
But actually, in
Twins
fact,
of Evil.
Yes, all of the Karnstein.
Yeah, because the Lust of the Vampire, or whatever it's called, because is that the one directed by Jemmy Sangster?
Yes.
Because
it's not as good.
It's been given a really bad rap, and when I first heard about it, and we've watched, I think it was the Mark Gatiss documentary.
Well, it's much more about.
They interviewed him, and he said that it was awful.
But it's also much more about boobs, basically boobs and blood. I think that's you can tell there is that moment in the 70s where it all changed.
Unfortunately, though, the whole trilogy is effectively I mean, I agree.
The Twins of Evil, I think, is great.
Yes,
really good.
But if you think about it, all three of them are exploitation movies.
Sure.
So
but I think there's a really good role for Cushing in the Twins of Evil, because again he's another kind of vampire hunter, but he's not Van Helsing. He's not really heroic.
He's killing innocent women.
And he doesn't understand how to combat evil. So yes, as you say, he's burning women at the stake, and he's playing a very puritanical man who's much more kind of narrow-minded in his views.
Arguably, the roles in which...
More of a villain, in fact.
Yeah, I think Cushing's more villainous roles are arguably more striking because they're so much... they're so opposite to the way that he really was.
The vampire in that film is also brilliant, and I can't remember the actor's name, but he's actually really good. The other thing I wanted to say concerning... oh, yes, what was I going to say? No, that was something else I was going to say, but I've forgotten now. Oh, gosh, this is going to annoy me. Maybe you go on speaking. But yeah, there was something else I was going to say about the vampires. And oh, yes, no, actually, I know what it was. There is a role in which Lee effectively plays the professor-type heroic role that traditionally Cushing might have played, and that's The Devil Rides Out.
It's brilliant.
Which is a Dennis Wheatley adaptation of a book. And in that, he's the older professor type who knows about the occult. And he's wonderfully called Richelieu, I think. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, deliberately has the name of a character from the Three Musketeers. Perhaps when you put your notes on, you'll be able to check that. But yeah, he's got a name that's obviously clearly.
But just speaking of The Devil Rides Out, I think it's really interesting. So Cushing and Lee, obviously, I would say that their best films are the ones in which they're together because they sort of bounce off each other, and there's that partnership, and you can feel like the
mutual
charisma
admiration.
is doubled. Yeah. But films like The Devil Rides Out and I Love the Island of Terror and The Skull are so brilliant on their own. Despite the fact that they're not in them together. Although no, sorry, The Skull does have both.
Well, they both have so much charisma, don't they?
The fact that I think you would agree that the kind of middle of like Dracula films feel like there's something missing. You almost want Van Helsing to appear.
You're waiting for them to
and
arrive.
I think that's because it's the script, isn't it? It's the formula that.
But also,
sometimes formula works, but
there's something that those
doesn't.
two actors bring to those roles.
Definitely.
They're never anything less but compelling.
And
you can't help but watch them.
I think,
and that's they both share that.
I understand that. I mean, I will say when it comes to things like Sherlock Holmes, I'm a bit of a period kind of purist. I would rather I do Sherlock, like the BBC series. I do love it.
Was good.
But I would rather watch the period things. And I know, and we've spoken a lot about Dracula, and I'm also aware of how long we've been filming, and we don't want to repeat of last time. But I know that you really liked the new Dracula. I was less keen on it because it's suddenly moved to modern day.
Oh, you know why they did that?
Yes, I do know. Yes. I know. No. We're not talking about that now.
Okay.
I was going to say I'm aware that there may be fans who don't like the two 70s films because they're a bit silly and they're kitsch, and they are quite far removed from. They don't feel part of the series, kind of.
Sure.
In terms of the canon, if you will. But I think they're important because after the first Dracula film, it doesn't feel like the story of Van Helsing and Dracula is finished.
You're right.
And that's why it's
Cushing's
interesting.
Not in them.
Because Cushing takes the ring at the end of Satanic Rites so that he can't come back again.
Sure.
And I think that's almost, I mean, he's obviously expressed a desire to stop existing, which is why he's unleashing space. So it's almost like a sort of a respect thing, but also I don't want to keep fighting.
And yet Hammer still persuaded Cushing to do another Dracula movie. By which point Lee was having nothing to do with it.
Well, it's not. That's the thing. It's not a Dracula movie.
It's another actor playing. Yeah, another actor playing Dracula incorporating kung fu. So it was just. I think that was just going too far, and I haven't seen it, and I'm kind of.
I think
reluctant to do so.
No, I think because I would like to make my questionable Cushings because it's fun to say, and I like watching funny films. Yeah. I think we should watch it and then do that as a questionable Cushing one because I think we know that it's going to be interesting, but I want to watch it. But I think that's.
We probably want to be rounding this up.
Yeah,
now, don't we?
There are definitely times where there's a film that almost feels like there's a hole in it because the cast isn't there, and when one actor is carrying an entire film, no matter how brilliant that actor is. No matter how brilliant the director is, you need good cast members to rely on and to have that sort of stream and sort of connecting like thread of ideas. And
well, I think it's the same in any era of film. There are just certain films where you just have a dream team of actors, and there are certain actors, it's not something that can be taught really. Just some actors have just got that X factor, that dynamic quality, and as we've said already, you can't help but watch what they do, and you can't take your eyes off them. And both Lee and Cushing have this.
Yeah.
Some other actors from the era do, but I don't think there's anyone that can really touch those two. There are a few that we also like.
I think, just sorry to cut you off there, but kind of as a closing point, I think whilst I would go for Cushing if I had to choose, I think it's good that we've been able to have a discussion and that it isn't kind of one or the other, because
this really wasn't a versus.
No, they were so closely linked. So their relationship was so important to, I think, affected their performances because they loved each other so much. And I think you can't really separate them. You certainly can't appreciate Lee's career or Cushing's career in its entirety without looking at the films that Cushing was in as well.
They still continue to inspire filmmakers now, and in fact I think we're entering an era where horror movies are taken quite seriously again, and there are directors, people like Tim Burton,
Guillermo del
Toro, yes, they're clearly influenced by the style of these films, and Mark Gatiss as well, with his Dracula. And then there's that group who were part of the League of Gentlemen. Inside Number 9 is clearly influenced by things like Amicus, by the kind of the portmanteau horrors. So these are people who are of a much younger generation, still they've grown up loving the style of these films and wanting to find actors that seem to slot into that kind of atmosphere again. And I think they've managed to do that quite well. And yes, it's nice that we still have these films to enjoy.
Because I think horror films, within their legacy, there's a pleasingly shaped Cushing and Lee whole. It's not just Cushing or Lee.
I love them both. I really do.
Yeah. So Cush Lee. At one point, I considered calling this channel Cush Lee Film Reviews. But yes, I think that's our conclusion, that we love them both. Personally, I do agree with you that they had different ambitions, they had different skills, and that's why I think it's so difficult to compare them, because they were so wonderful and so amazing within their own right. I've really enjoyed doing this with you.
Well, thank you.
Have you?
I mean, to be honest, I'm quite tired this evening. It's been a long day, but I am pleased I did this.
I would love to. I know that we spoke about Hammer quite a bit, but it would be lovely if we could do a kind of a more amicus.
And I know that there'll be people on YouTube that obviously have met more of the cast, or perhaps some of the writers and directors, and we so far haven't had the pleasure of meeting anybody from that era.
One day.
But we've been fans for a long time, and obviously it's before my time as well. I mean, I was watching films back in the 1980s and 90s, and these are films from the 50s to the 70s, so even before I was born. So I think we're about to die in terms of the videos, so I think we need to round up, don't we? We need to finish up. So did you want to say any closing?
Thank you so much for watching, and hopefully we'll get to do something like this again soon.
Thank you for joining us.
Bye.